Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm Chris James, your host. Tonight, we're going to be talking about some strange travels. To begin with, Thursday, my wife and I took a drive to San Marcos. My wife wanted to look at dresses, and I was going to look for a compressor. We had a good time, and we were going to see about dinner right after the last store. As my wife was checking out, the girl at the cash register asked if we'd bothered to gas up. She said she had to stop at 5 stations before finding any fuel. I thought maybe she was just exaggerating a little. Well, instead of looking for dinner, we went looking for gas. Every station in San Marcos was empty. We thought just maybe if we drove south, away from town, we might find some place that still had fuel, someplace away from town. I turned the AC off, put the cruise control at 55, and we drove and drove. I had less than a half a tank of gas and 200 miles to go. We could see cars sitting on the side of the road that, well, apparently they were out of fuel. 18-wheelers were running out as well. We drove by dozens of gas stations, all with signs saying they had no gas. I didn't much like the idea of being stranded on the side of the road. As we would approach a gas station, we'd pull over, look to see if the pumps had bags over the nozzles. Well, they all did. And finally, I saw a station ahead, and I asked my wife what she thought. And she said, let's try it and see. The station was a Love's at South Natalia, a number 471. And there were about 100 cars in line waiting to gas up. I pulled in line and waited, hoping the station wouldn't run out of gas before we managed to fill up. No one was rude. Everybody waited their turn. The folks talked back and forth about how bizarre this situation was. We finally got rolling back to Laredo with enough gas to get home. I thought when we got there the city would be empty of gas, but the stations at home still had fuel. Now some rotten people were charging up to $10 a gallon. The karma will get them someday. I topped off my tank and only had to pay $2.49 a gallon. I got to wondering if all those stations had actually run out, or were they holding some gas just waiting for the prices to go up? But that's just a conspiracy thinker inside me. One day, working for the government, I was sent out to El Paso to obtain some medical equipment coming from a decommissioned field hospital. This was an on-duty detail, but we would be in civilian clothes since we were expected to chase anyone. We left Laredo, and it was the first part of January. The weather was nice, only 80 degrees. In order to bring back as much of the equipment as we could, we were given this great big old truck pulling a 40-foot trailer. The trip out was as exciting as watching the highway stretch out in front of the hood. The closer to El Paso we got, the colder it got. Snow began to fall around Fort Stockton. As we entered Fort Bliss, I was glad we were finally there so I could get some rest. I parked the truck next to the warehouse with the hospital equipment in it, and I went to check in. I was told we could use the FEMA trailers parked out all along the fence. Well, we went out to see what we would find and see what kind of sleeping arrangements there were. None of the trailers had power. This meant none of them had heat. My partner took one look at the cold, nasty rooms and left in search of a ride into town. She wouldn't or couldn't drive the truck, but she did manage to find a ride. I had been in the Army. I'd put up with some very nasty conditions in my time. I figured this was just going to be a little bad. Grabbing a bunch of blankets, I snuggled into a bed and tried to sleep. I don't like the cold. I find anything below 60 way too much. The snow outside was turning into ice. I don't know for sure, but I think it was about 20 degrees outside, and that meant it was 20 degrees inside as well. I didn't get much sleep. I finally gave up around 4 and went out and sat in the truck. I used to be able to sleep in the gunner's seat inside the turret of a tank. I got used to sleeping in a nice warm bed, and that night, well, I just didn't sleep. The sun finally came up, and I stepped outside. It was cold, but the warehouse did have a bit of heat. I began grabbing first aid equipment and piling it onto the trailer. Sometime around 10, my partner showed up. She didn't much like the idea of getting dirty, so she tended to stand around and visit with guys who were standing around watching me work. I came close to saying something to her, but I decided to hold my tongue. I'm not very good at not saying things without thinking, but I was too focused on rummaging through the warehouse, and so I left her alone. I finished loading all the things that looked usable and went to clean up. There was a building with heat and hot showers just a few blocks away. Lo and behold, I ran into some guys from Laredo who had been there training. This was their last day, and tomorrow they're all heading back to Laredo. Being training, none of them brought their uniforms. We got to talking, and they said not only did they have a heated trailer, there was an extra bed. One of the guys that was supposed to have come along with them hadn't made the trip. So that night, I got to spend it in a nice, warm, comfy bed. The next morning, my partner announced she wasn't going to ride all the way back to Laredo in that stinky truck. She was going to grab a ride with one of the guys heading to Laredo. Dave, who lived in San Antonio, said if she was going to bail on me, he'd like to ride back. In fact, he said he'd help drive as well. We checked the load in the back of the trailer to be sure nothing would fall off, and then we hit the road. The truck wasn't that loaded, but it had seen better days. It ran badly, and as we slipped out of El Paso with 700 miles to go, the temperature gauge started to creep up. On the drive up, I'd had to stop every 200 miles and gas up. This beast was getting about 10 miles to a gallon. The gas gauge was screwy. It would stay at full for about 150 miles and then plummet to empty in no time at all. I would drive to the next gas station, and then Dave would take a turn. We talked about everything from scary movies to weird people we'd run into at work. Well, the engine kept trying to overheat. This was back when few people had cell phones. We did have our two-way radios, so I called the other guys from Laredo, and I let them know we were having engine trouble. The supervisor, Rudy, who had been at training, zipped into town ahead, and he got a garage ready to try and fix the truck. It took him a few hours, but we did finally get on the road. But just as a safety precaution, we took several gallon jugs of water and placed them in the bed of the truck, just in case. The other guys were in a hurry to get back to Laredo, and so they kind of took off without us, and Me and Dave were left to tool along as the sun was going down, all to our lonesome. And at that, I'm going to take a brief pause and play a couple commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after these important messages. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. Coffee, nectar of the gods. And at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, you'll find coffee made the right way, one delicious cup at a time. Stop on by 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at.
We gotta say goodbye.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back. We were just talking about me and Dave as we were plowing our way across West Texas. Well, the gas gauge did its weird thing, and soon it was time to gas up. I started looking for a gas station, and shortly the needle started bouncing on the E. It was starting to look rather bad, and, well, the others were way out of radio range. Me and Dave were starting to get a little worried. Finally, on the side of the road, Dave spotted a sign that said, gas, with an arrow pointing off the side of the road. It was one of those green roadside markers, and, well, we took the exit. We didn't have any choice. The road wound around, and then it crossed the highway. As I drove, the road was very narrow, and trees were brushing along both sides of the truck and the trailer. If a car had come from the other direction, there was no room to pass or turn around. "This is weird," Dave said, and, well, I said it was kind of spooky, too. After a few miles, we finally came to the gas station. Sort of. The parking lot was gravel. There were just 2 pumps out by the side of the building. The pumps had an old light bulb hanging from a cord suspended from the cover. The building looked as if it had been painted back in the turn of the century. The road dead-ended just a short ways from the station. The steam was coming from under the hood as I shut off the engine. Apparently the garage hadn't fixed the problem in the least. Dave grabbed the nozzle and was going to gas up, so I went inside to pay because they didn't have one of those slots that you run your card through at the gas pump. I stepped through the door and froze. The very first thought in my mind was I'd left my pistol in the truck. The interior of the store was dark. There weren't enough lights on over any of the shelves. There were maybe a dozen men, all sitting in metal folding chairs, crowded around an old black and white TV. The rabbit ears had tinfoil wrapped around it. They all turned and looked at me at once. Some were wearing overalls, and some were dressed like they'd been hunting. Nobody said a word. The guy behind the counter wasn't wearing a shirt or any shoes, just his pants. He just stood there staring at me. I would have run out the door, but we needed gas, and this was looking like our only hope. I told the guy behind the counter I wanted to fill up and handed him the government credit card. He looked at it, then he looked at me. He turned around, he looked out the dirty window at the truck parked by the pumps. Then he looked at me some more, and then at the card. He finally ran it through the card reader. I looked around the store to be sure none of the cast from Deliverance was trying to sneak up on me. Had I heard banjo music, I would have run for it. Dave came walking in to see if there were any snacks to buy. He got 1 foot inside the door and froze. I saw his right hand creep to his belt, right where his pistol would have been. He'd left his pistol in the truck as well. He looked around and slowly backed out the door. I grabbed the credit card and the receipt, and I followed Dave. At the truck, I noticed Dave had the door open and his bag, with his pistol, was sitting right next to him as he finished topping off the radiator. We jumped in the truck and got out of there. That was when I noticed the entire time in the store, nobody had said a word. Somehow we got to San Antonio and I dropped Dave off at his place. I then limped on home to Laredo. I was glad to shut down that truck and walk away from it. Later that year, my wife wanted to drive over to San Diego. She had a big business convention to attend. I knew where the mystery gas station should be. I watched for the sign announcing the station, but the sign was gone. I didn't want to stop. I just wanted to be sure I hadn't dreamt the whole thing up. It should have been somewhere between Ozona and Sheffield, right off of I-10. Dave remembers the place as well. It's what we talk about any time we run into each other. And back to the drive to San Diego. We're tooling along in my new Honda Ridgeline. I think I'd had it maybe 6 months. The sun was down and we were tired, so we thought we'd exit at the next town and look for a hotel. We saw a town just ahead, so we pulled off the interstate and followed the signs that led us to what we hoped was a nice, clean hotel. There were lots of buildings. They were all dark. The street lights were all off as well. I didn't think too much about it. We drove from one end of town to the other. There wasn't a single light to be seen. We drove back through town just a bit slower, trying to spot the hotel the sign on the interstate had proclaimed was there. Even what few signs we saw were dark. It looked like they're having a major power outage, but we didn't see any people or any other cars either. We pulled back onto I-10 and drove on to the next town. That was just one weird little town. At 62 years old, Detroit native Ray Tomlinson was driving from Arizona to Michigan with his 93-year-old mother and 31-year-old girlfriend. Let's see, he was 62 and she was 31, so he was twice her age. The trio were in Ray's van when something rather unusual happened. His girlfriend died. She stopped breathing somewhere in either Oklahoma or Texas. Nobody is sure if it was him or his mother who discovered the young woman was dead. But they didn't want to stop, and so they didn't. They both thought you didn't have to report a death for the first 48 hours. They continued driving on to Michigan. 2 days on the road with a dead body that was in the process of decomposing. How high can you set the air conditioning to slow down the process? Why didn't they stop and tell the police? What were they thinking? Once they arrived in Michigan, The authorities found them, and an investigation was pursued. It turned out the girlfriend had a long history of suicide attempts. An empty bottle of OxyContin was found under her seat. I wonder about what those two were thinking as the smell kept getting worse with each passing mile. At some point they had to stop for the night. Sleeping in a van with a dead body. No, thank you. The authorities decided the man and his mother, while not being the sharpest pair of bowling balls, were not guilty of the woman's death. Frederick Benjamin Carlin, known as Ben to just about everyone, wanted to do something nobody had ever dreamed of. Born in July 27, 1912, in Australia, he worked as a mining engineer. He worked in China, designing the British coal mines there. As World War II was getting into gear, Ben became a member of the Indian Army Corps of Engineers. He served in India, Italy, and the Middle East. The Allies used a number of different amphibious vehicles. One of the more common was the Ford GPA, known as a Seep. Carlin had noticed a GPA in an Army vehicle lot. He suggested the vehicle could be used to take him around the world, which caused his fellow engineers to laugh and suggest he was crazy. Carlin said, with a bit of tinkering, the vehicle could be made seaworthy, and there was no reason it couldn't make the trip. Well, once the war was over, and Carlin was discharged, he immigrated to the United States, and he married a Red Cross nurse named Eleanor Aaron, whom he'd met while overseas. I thought I had an original idea for a honeymoon when I suggested we go to Disney World. Well, Carlin told his new bride they were going to drive around the world. Literally. He proposed that they buy an old used Army amphibious vehicle and use it to cross the oceans and drive the continents, becoming the first couple to go around the world in a vehicle. The really surprising thing was she agreed. He bought a Ford Seep, and they got to work refitting it for sea travel. Carlin asked the Ford Motor Company to finance his trip. They decided the idea was just way too crazy and it was destined for failure. The Seep was designed for crossing rivers, maybe a small lake. It was not very fast and it sat low in the water. It was never intended to be used in any kind of rough weather. Carlin designed and built a boat-like prow to attach to the grill. He put on a rudder and a large cabin and 2 extra fuel tanks. One was attached to the bow and the second was underneath the frame of the craft. Inside the cabin, a bunk was installed, and the dash was modified to include aircraft instruments, as well as a 2-way radio. The vehicle was lengthened by 3 feet, making it 18 feet long, and the fuel capacity was beefed up to 200 gallons. The vessel was christened the Half Safe, a jingle used by the Arid Deodorant Company, which went, "Don't be half safe, use Arid to be sure." An amphibious vehicle named after a deodorant. What could possibly go wrong? 1947, yes, the same year as the Roswell crash, Ben and Eleanor gave the Half Safe its first test run. The cabin filled with exhaust fumes, and they both became sick and dizzy from it. Carlin had to redesign the vehicle to make it less of a death trap. The big day came in 1948. They set sail, or drive, they set out from New York and headed towards England. They managed to motor about 40 miles before landing at Shark River, New Jersey. The steering was all cattywampus, and they couldn't get the half safe to stay in a straight line. The pair spent a few years trying to raise money to make some much-needed changes to their floating car. They added a small float to the rear which could hold more fuel. Food and water was increased to a 6 weeks provision. Now, this was probably one of their better ideas. By 1950, they were once more ready to cross the Atlantic Ocean in an 18-foot-long vehicle. The couple left Halifax on July 19, 1950. About mid-Atlantic, they ran into a storm. This wasn't anything like what just hit the Gulf Coast, but sitting an 18-foot vehicle in the ocean with 10-foot waves crashing over the cabin, it was more than the couple had planned for. Ben was trying to steer, while Eleanor bailed. Water was seeping in from a dozen places. They were tossed and spun by the waves. At times, Ben couldn't see out the windshield. The water was coming faster than the wipers could handle. The sound of water crashing over their tiny vessel made communications impossible. The couple were in a life-or-death struggle for days. Somehow, I think more luck than anything else, they found themselves slipping out of the east side of the storm. The engine was fouled, and Ben had to do some in-water mechanics. He removed the cylinder head so he could scrape the carbon buildup from the valves. The radio had quit working, which had led the folks back home to think perhaps the couple had sunk. After a 32-day voyage, they arrived in Flores, the most westerly island of the Azores. They were about 2/3 of the way to Portugal. They resupplied and fixed all the broken equipment. Once on land, they decided they were going to change their next stop to Morocco instead of Portugal. And don't go away. Once more, it's time for a couple of commercials. We'll be right back after these messages. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. Looking for a great cup of coffee, but you just don't know where to find one? Stop on by the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Tell Julio or Marta you want some of the best coffee on earth. Remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? You need to go to Del Norte Optical at 107 Calle del Norte and go have your vision fixed. That's not a UFO, that's a weather balloon.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back. And now let's get back to Ben and Eleanor's misadventures in the Atlantic. From Morocco, Ben and Eleanor drove north to the Straits of Gibraltar. After the storm in the Atlantic, the water of the Mediterranean must have been quite pleasant. From Gibraltar, they drove and sailed to England, where they planned to stop over and do more repairs and some fundraising. The repairs were accomplished with help from RAF Group Captain Malcolm Bunting, who had served with Carlin while in India. To raise money, the half-safe was exhibited in department stores throughout Europe. Some people would pay in order to have a look at the Jeep that had crossed the Atlantic. Carlin wrote a book called Half-Safe Across the Atlantic by Jeep. He told his story on crossing an ocean and battling a hurricane in a vehicle. He sold 32,000 copies, and the book was translated into 5 languages. You can get a copy from Amazon for $50 today. In 1955, the Carlins drove from France to India, where they set out for Australia. Instead of trying to sail from Calcutta, India to Australia, they had the half-safe transported by steamship. They did the whole fundraising and sightseeing drive around the Down Under. When it was finally time to return to India, Eleanor had decided she'd had enough. Seasickness and constant travel was just too much. She returned to the United States, and Ben took the half-safe back on the road and on the water. Barry Hanley, another Australian, joined up with Ben, and they accompanied him to Japan and then to Hong Kong. The pair was mobbed by autograph-seeking girls who considered the half-safe and its passengers like a couple of rock stars. From Japan, the half-safe headed north through Russia, en route to the crossing to the Aleutian Islands. Now a news reporter, Boyer Lafayette de Monte, from the Japan Times, was now accompanying Ben. The crossing to Alaska was not too nasty. They managed to avoid any rough seas and soon made their way to Anchorage. De Monte left the expedition and he returned to his home in Arizona. Ben was now driving back to the United States along the Alaskan Highway. Once he arrived in California, Ben picked Eleanor up in San Francisco. They had been apart for 2 years. Some honeymoon. Carlin then drove across the United States and up into Canada. He and his trusty Seep, the half-safe, arrived in Montreal, Canada on May 13, 1958. His 10-year drive was finally at its end. Ben and the half-safe had traveled 11,050 miles by sea and 38,987 miles by land over a 10-year period. 50,037 miles. The trip to Australia wasn't counted. The half-safe had passed through 38 countries and over 2 oceans. The entire trip had cost Ben about $35,000. Today, the Goldford Grammar School in Perth, Australia, owns the half-safe. That was his school. The vehicle is on display in front of Carlin's old school. The school also posthumously published the other half of Half-Safe, which detailed the second portion of Carlin's journey. Can't find that one anywhere. Now that's what I call a road trip. And now for some more wonders from down under. September 2016. The police arrived at the Tromp farm and found it in disarray. The front door was standing open. Inside, papers were scattered everywhere. Credit cards were sitting on the table, along with cell phones belonging to the family. The cars parked outside all had the keys still in the ignition. The police put out a lookout for members of the family. Once the family was located, the story went from odd to totally bizarre. On Monday, August 29th, Mark and Jacoba Tromp left their farm in Sylvan, Victoria, Australia. Sylvan is a small town where people know each other. The Tromp family was no different. The 3 adult children, Rihanna, Mitchell, and Ella, went along with the father and mother. They took one car and drove away as if pursued by monsters or demons. They wound up in Bathurst, New South Wales, 512 miles away. The son, Mitchell, had brought his phone along, but had thrown it out the window after about the first half hour. Tuesday, Mitchell left his family in Bathurst, and he took a train back to Melbourne, where he contacted the police. He told the authorities that his family had become increasingly paranoid. They began to fear for their lives, and so they ran, leaving behind their cell phones so they couldn't be tracked. The sisters, Ella and Rihanna, stayed with their parents until late on Tuesday. When the family were near the Jenolan Caves, the 2 girls, women actually, left their parents. Ella stole a car and drove back to Goulburn, where she reported to the police that her parents were missing. Rihanna broke into a pickup and was hiding in the back seat. The owner got in the next day and was surprised to see her legs sticking out from the back seat. The owner said, "I turned around when I saw 2 legs stretched across the back between my seat and the floor. She was laying on the floor. I asked her who she was and if she was all right. She didn't know her name and had no idea where she was." Rihanna was still confused when the police arrived to question her. Wednesday night, a couple out playing Pokemon Go were driving along a road when a set of headlights came up on their back bumper. The car got right on the back bumper. The driver pulled off the road to let the other vehicle go by, but it pulled over behind him. The driver of the second car got out and stood in the middle of the road before running away into the brush. When shown a photograph of Mr. Tromp, he identified him as the driver of the second car. On Thursday, September 1st, the mother, Jacoba Tromp, was found wandering around in Yaz, a town outside of Canberra. She was confused and looked as if she were in shock. The police transported her to the nearby hospital. After checking for any life-threatening injuries, she was transported to the same facility where her daughter, Rihanna, was sent for psychiatric care. On Saturday, the father, Mark Tromp, was finally located, walking along the streets close to the Warringata Airport. The following Tuesday, Mark Tromp released a statement apologizing for his weird behavior. In the statement, he said, "In recent days, my family has become through a difficult period. We will soon be reunited together. I hope that we will begin to make sense of our ordeal and return to a normal life. More than anything, my family and I need time to recover and receive appropriate assistance, including mental health services." The police tried to find any indication as to what could have driven the entire family to do such bizarre activity. They didn't find any drugs or hallucinogenics at the farm or in their car. I've seen one person become overcome with some fear and panic. That person's actions were transferred to another. Kind of a chain reaction. As soon as the second person had a few seconds to think, he relaxed. The guy who started it all took several minutes of sitting and relaxing before the fear finally left him. This had happened at a fire, and it wasn't all that bizarre. 5 people all sharing in an irrational belief that lasted for 6 days? I find this way too odd. Being into conspiracies, I would look into some kind of a government experiment gone wrong. However, As soon as the family was away from the area, the effects should have stopped. Maybe some gas coming from an unknown source. Still, as soon as the family was down the road a ways, the effects should have gone away. Now, these next stories aren't so much trips, but they are interesting places to drive. A75, Kinmont Strait, southwest Scotland. For the last 60 years, this road has been the scene of a number of weird reports of activity that can only be called paranormal. Activities have been so frequent that the road has been nicknamed the Ghost Road. In 1957, a truck driver saw a couple walking in front of his truck. He slammed on the brakes, but the truck took too long to stop, and he thought for sure he'd run them both over. Getting out of the driver's seat on shaking legs, the driver searched for the bodies. He looked behind his truck. Then he looked underneath. He tried yelling to see if anyone would call for help. Nothing. The people have said they saw screaming hags on the side of the road as they drove by. Looking back, there was never anyone there. Others have seen eyeless phantoms. Then there's an entire menagerie of otherworldly creatures seen on this famous and infamous road. In 1962, Derek and Norman Ferguson were driving on A75 when they thought they saw a large hen flapping its wings and coming straight at their windshield. The hen seemed to be pursued by a group of giant cats. There was a phantom furniture van that vanished as soon as they saw it. Now, these two reported this to the police. The police had no reason to believe either of these two were on drugs or drunk. They simply could not explain these sightings. Bob Sturgeon lives near the A75. He used to run a roadside snack truck near the location of the sightings hotspot. There was very rarely a week went past without somebody telling me about some experience, and usually along the Kinmont Strait, he'd said. The truck drivers would frequent his snack truck after having some bizarre experience while parked at a nearby rest area. In Scotland, these are called lay-bys. They would be parked, catching a quick nap, when something would appear by their truck. After nearly being scared to death, they would have to get out and walk a bit to get the images out of their head. Mr. Sturgeon's was the place to stop and get whatever it was you'd seen off your chest. Many people reported seeing what looked like a group of dejected, bedraggled-looking people pulling hand carts or carrying bundles like refugees fleeing a war zone. Some witnesses said they looked like camp followers who had come along behind an army in order to make money doing services needed by the soldiers, things like mending clothes or cooking food. One man was so shocked he gave up earning a living driving a truck. Mr. Sturgeon said after telling how he had awoken late at night to witness a parade of people shuffling by, they looked like players from a medieval movie, said the line stretched out forever. They just kept dragging by. Some looked like they were on their last legs. After his weird sighting, the driver never came by again. The most haunted place in Ohio is called Dead Man's Curve. It has a very dark history. This haunted stretch of road is between Amelia and Bethel in the village of Bantam in Claremont County. It is where Route 222 meets Route 125. There have been people who see a hitchhiker on the side of the road. If they slow down to pick him up, they notice he doesn't have a face. Just a head, but there's nothing on it. He is usually roaming the area late at night between 1:20 and 1:40 a.m. He's trying to hitch a ride. On a few occasions, he's been seen standing in the middle of the road. A driver will see him at the last second, thinking they've run the guy over. When they stop, there's nothing there. Only the shaking from thinking they'd killed someone. Other drivers have said someone has thrown rocks at their car as they drove by the area. With this, we're going to take a brief pause and play a couple commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. Back in 1776, one of our founding fathers said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel about your coffee, you need to go buy the Organic Man Coffee Trike and have a cup of the best coffee on the world. 4501 McPherson, number 9. And remember, life is way too short for drinking bad coffee. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at.
Though we gotta say goodbye.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arkanasa Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arkanasa Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back. We were talking about Dead Man's Curve in Ohio. At one time, back in the past, the road had a hazardous curve in it. The curve was sharp and sudden, and if you're traveling over the speed limit, it would kind of come up on you. The road had first been built back in 1831. As the road approached a hill, it took a sharp curve. Horses pulling wagons found this curve dangerous, and on occasion they would wind up running off the side of the road. It was improved over the years, but the curve was still designed for 1800s traffic. With vehicles driving faster each year, soon the curve became unmanageable. Several cars wound up running off the road. When the road was rebuilt, the location of the curve was bypassed. The road was straightened out, and the curve was lessened. Now you don't need to be on your toes as you approach this location. The road just winds leisurely along to the right. No one can say for sure who the faceless hitchhiker is. One of the many people who died as a result of the old road. This is a favorite hangout during Halloween. Blood's Point Road in Boone County, Illinois, is one of the most haunted roads in that area. To make matters worse, there's a cemetery just off of it. And people driving by on this road have seen some bizarre things that they talk about. The name is enough to excite images of mass murders and serial killers. If you look into the past hoping to find some wild story, you're going to be disappointed. The road was named for Arthur Blood, who was the first person to settle there and build a house. Even with such a mundane past history, the road is still host to some wild specters. The people have seen a mysterious pickup truck that will come screeching around corners, only to vanish just before it hits anyone. One person says he saw an 18-wheeler pass by and then it disappeared. There's a railroad trestle nearby where some strange things have gone on. It is said there have been quite a few suicides from the bridge. Between 4 to 8 people are supposed to have hanged themselves from the side. Some claim a Blood and his wife were hanged from the bridge as well. There is a story of a witch being one of the victims. She is said to have hung out under the bridge. When Arthur Blood's kids came along, they became mesmerized by the witch. She cast a spell on them and then sent them on their way. The townspeople are supposed to have decided that this was evil, and they hunted her down. When she was caught, they hung her from the side of the rail. The kids were still under the influence of the witch, even after she was dead. The locals began to suspect Arthur Blood and his family of some bizarre activity. They began to taunt them, and they slowly drove the entire family to suicide. Other people say that the witch hung her children from the bridge, or that she committed suicide in an identical fashion. The cemetery has a few phantoms of its own. People have heard children laughing in and around the headstones. This happens when there are no kids around. People also have seen an orb flighting about amongst the tombstones. There's a dog that people see which vanishes and then reappears in a different part of the cemetery. Running from Gallup, New Mexico, and going north to Monticello, Utah, is a highway with a bad reputation. The name is what started it all. It began life as a branch off of US 60. Each highway branch was given a number, such as 605 and 606. Well, the folks in Kentucky began to complain because the number US 60 was already taken, and it would become confusing to have 2 US 60s. So US 60 in New Mexico became US 66. No problem until the branches all got changed as well. Now there was a 665 and a 666. Highway 666 ran from New Mexico to Utah. The people began reporting strange things going on along this highway. Some people said huge black dogs with bright red eyes had chased them along the pavement. Not one or two, but dozens of people said this. These dogs would be called hellhounds by those who saw them. This pack of hounds can run up to 80 miles an hour, according to those who have tried to outrun them. The dogs will attempt to jump through the window if one is open. Then there's a black sedan that comes out of nowhere and chases other drivers on the highway. This happens late at night when there are few cars on the road. Anyone traveling along 666 will suddenly become overcome by a feeling of dread. Then they'll see a set of headlights coming up from behind, fast. No matter how fast the driver goes, the headlights will still gain on them. Then the phantom car will either simply vanish, or it'll pass as if the driver is sitting still. If you glance at the car as it passes, the car is empty. There is no driver. As the devil's sedan speeds by or vanishes, the bad feelings will go away along with it. Vehicles have been known to break down for no reason or have flat tires even though the tire has no hole in it. The disabled driver, when pulls to the side of the road to see about repairs, as he or she works on their vehicle, a huge truck will come flying by, passing so close that they nearly hit the driver or his vehicle. The truck is traveling so fast that the wind from it will push the person over. Many have said it looks like the truck swerves as if it's trying to hit them. Many drivers have seen a young girl standing on the side of the road in a white dress. She looks lost, so they'll pull over to see if she needs help. As soon as they stop, the girl will vanish. She's not hitchhiking, just standing there. Then there are other spirits seen that are thought to be evil. They exude a malevolent feeling as people drive by. No one has any interest in even slowing down, let alone stopping. The skinwalkers are an Indian form of a witch, only nothing as nice as the ones from Europe. A skinwalker is an evil person who can only attain his classification by murdering someone, or sometimes several people. Once they are skinwalkers, this gives them the ability to transform themselves into animals. In some tribes, it is policy. If a person was known to be a skinwalker, they would be killed and buried under piles of rocks to trap their spirit in the ground. From then on, the area would be considered cursed. People driving along 666 have seen what appears to be a man standing on the side of the road. As they drove by, the man would suddenly transform into a wolf or other huge creature, and then begin pursuing the driver. The animal would run along the side of the highway at anywhere up to 60 miles an hour. On other occasions, people driving along late at night will suddenly see some kind of an animal standing in the road. As they draw near, the animal will just stand there as if it wants to attack the oncoming vehicle, snarling and snapping right up until the final second. Should the vehicle run over the animal, the car will experience either engine trouble or a flat tire. The creature's intent is to get the vehicle to stop so the skinwalker can capture their soul and use it for his nastiness. Some folks traveling on Highway 666 have vanished without a trace. They will start out heading down the road but never arrive at their destination. Even after a complete search, there is no sign of them. Then, after a few days, the missing person would reappear with no knowledge of having been gone. To them, they started out driving along the highway and then arrived at their destination in just about the right amount of time. Others have started out driving along the road, only to find themselves driving along an old gravel road. It was as if they had driven back in time to when there was no pavement. Some have said the pavement looked old and cracked, as if it had been there for a few hundred years. In a bid to get rid of the number that some feel is the sign of the beast, the state officials renamed it US 491. There are still signs all along proclaiming it as the former US 666. Even with the new name, things still happen that no one can explain. So, next time you have an urge to take a drive, check to be sure you're not going to be driving on some road or highway that might have a curse or other problems. If you do see something, try to get some photos, but don't disappear if you can help it. I hope you enjoyed the last hour. If you did, tell your friends. We're here every Saturday. If you want more of the show, check us out at strangethings.podomatic.com. If you'd like to contact us, either tell us a good story of your own or simply to say hi, you can get to us by writing to strangethings@arkanasa.com. Till next week, I hope you've enjoyed the show.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight? night in the hanging tree.